To introduce Neil Frost, a senior teacher for 15 years, and for the last 5 years, the head teacher of Marshall Parks Academy in Romford, and they're part of the South West Essex Community Education Trust. Now, Neil, I met you firstly about 3 years ago, and in our first quite lengthy conversation, a couple of things really hit home during that conversation. Firstly was your passion for inclusion. And secondly, just how high your expectations were for every pupil within your school. And that definitely left a mark for me in that conversation. Two things I think must be really tough to manage in lockdown. And before I get into the meat of that, I'd just like to ask you, not as the head teacher, but as Neil, how have you managed lockdown for you and your family? How have you found it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. I won't lie, I've actually enjoyed spending a little bit of extra time with my own children, being able to do some family things. I think there's been highs and lows. I think some of the lows are the point when my children don't understand that I've got to be in work mode. They don't understand that I've got a meeting and that perhaps I've got 3, 4, 5 hours of meetings back to back, and yet they need a hand with their homework. I think that's difficult. I think the length of the day has been strange. In that the peaks and troughs at different times. That quiet time that personally I've always enjoyed first thing in the morning. That quiet time, having a cup of coffee, getting my day in order. A bit like you, Dean. I'm an early riser, I'm missing that. My chief operating officer in the trust and myself tend to do a lot of work at between kind of 5:30 and 7 in the morning before our children are up, as an example, and an awful lot of work in the evening. And I've tried desperately to manage it so that I have time between kind of 8:30 and 10 in the school time to make sure both my children get up and ready and are on their learning. So there's been ups and downs. I think that the low point was undoubtedly a couple of weeks ago, with sort of announcements are coming back and then lots of letters coming through from unions and professional associations about what the risk action plans were. And yet we had so many shifting parameters. I think it was quite tricky. And I think a lot of head teachers that I talk to, I hear about online, felt really under threat at that moment and intimidated at that moment. And I think that led to a lot of lows for a lot of people. I think other than that, I think there's some routines being settled into now. Finding the routine to make sure that every evening we go out and do some form of exercise as a family, especially when the rules were quite rigid in lockdown. Just to make sure that we're not just working 24/7 and neglecting our own children in that sense at home. So we've got there. We've got through it, and I think we can see a sort of light at the end of the tunnel now, insofar as it's clear that we're beginning to go into a more softer phase of lockdown. We're beginning to reopen, if that's the government's phraseology, and I think we're all appreciative of those little perks in life. First world problems, I know, but the Costa's reopening of the world, the Starbucks, and so I think that's probably just eased that phase now of people feeling a little bit better about life, and I put myself in that group. Don't get me wrong, as a head teacher, I'm used to being in control every day of my life, and therefore the ability to distance, carry out that process, I think has been difficult, because you're trying to puppeteer people from a distance in that sense. You're trying to find out what's happening on the ground. Too many Zoom calls, too many voice calls, and not enough actual feeling things. And so that lack of being able to feel what's happening becomes really difficult, I think, in a very human-centered profession as we have in teaching.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I do hear from lots that there is a part of lockdown that is enjoyable. Spending time with your children, definitely, I've enjoyed that. I think it's been better because the weather's been nice, which has definitely helped. But yeah, you do feel like just the Costas and the Starbucks opening, a bit of normality is really helpful.
Yeah, look, don't get me wrong. I resurrected my dartboard from 35 years ago and put it up on a garden wall so that I could go outside. If the weather had been awful, you can't do that. So my darts average has increased at least.
Oh, well, there's a positive for you. Just go to, I know you've mentioned there the uncertainty. I mean, if you can cast your mind back to March when this happened, and I remember speaking to schools and they thought they were closing and then they weren't closing. Boris announced they wouldn't. There was a lot of self-isolation within teaching because obviously the fears that were there that happened in other industries. How did you, the school, act so quickly to get emergency timetables in place and get those rotas and online learning? Because that's quite a logistical task.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I considered it that sudden, actually. I think we'd watched what was happening coming across Europe, and we had realised that there was probably an inevitability of some form of lockdown, whether soft or hard. And except for that one particular week when there was a difference between the sense of official lockdown and unofficial lockdown, where we had to give preeminence to the school that was still officially open. Effectively, we were ready to go into lockdown probably 2 to 3 weeks before we did. We had the first work packs ready. We had the staff rotas ready. We had sort of logistics of how we were going to operate the front office ready. And if anything, we were surprised it went on slightly as long as it did. The sort of the soft lockdown period, if we cast our minds back, was probably when we were expecting a little bit deeper knowledge of how schools were going to close. Although, as my senior leadership team will testify, I called the date exactly right that we'd go into lockdown. So I'm feeling very smug about it. And as such, that meant we were ready to roll. I think it worked very conveniently, which is why I think the date was chosen. It meant we got 2 weeks in before Easter holidays, which if you like, was a bit of a dry run at things, which we could then iron out. And then obviously Easter was probably difficult because we had that sense of, yes, we had rotas, and yes, we were looking after the students that were in school, which I know we'll come back to later. But actually, we were also beginning to think about the challenges of what online learning should look like. And I think, you've got a full spectrum of views there, from schools that have done very little and have taken a very laissez-faire approach and left the students to work, through to schools that are doing, effectively every single lesson online as if it was in school somehow through various platforms, particularly Teams, I think. And we decided from the outset we wanted to have a middle ground, that we wanted to do work packs that gave parents and students flexibility at home to shuffle their logistics around, not expecting work to be due in the hour that the work was set. For example, I can testify from my own experience at home that can be really challenging when you've got your own meetings, you've got your own, you've got limited access to the number of computers, and I don't belittle my own relatively affluence in this process. But even in our household, we only have 3 laptops between 4 of us. And therefore there's a challenge there that presents itself in all households, I think, within reason. And so we set us a mindset to have work packs ready. The work packs were ready from all of my middle leaders, had all their work packs ready to go about a week and a half before we locked down. So that first one went in. All work packs now are checked effectively 6 working days before they go live, ready for the next batch of work. And at the moment, that means that we're in, logistically speaking, we're in a good state of affairs. The last week, yes, I lost about a fifth of my workforce went down for some reason or another, mainly because they were vulnerable themselves, or because they were living with vulnerable relatives in their household. Interesting mix of people in that regard, because obviously there were people that lived with children that were at school that perhaps vulnerable, had to start looking, were being sent home from school, so that could take childcare into account. But also, for example, a number of my Muslim staff who live in large extended families that perhaps have, relatively speaking, more elderly members of their family, and therefore tends to bring with it more underlying vulnerability of illness. And therefore, a sizable, significant proportion of those staff also went off on long-term absence in that sense. So that was difficult. Our student numbers dropped to about 70% by the end of the week we locked down. But I think that meant that we were balancing on a day-to-day basis of what we could deliver and how we could pull groups together into a whole for some centralised learning. But I think we got through it. And we managed to get Year 11s a send-off, which I think for the Year 11 students who perhaps were saddened by the sudden announcement, because to them it was sudden, and obviously left them in limbo about their exams in that initial period, until Williamson confirmed what the intention was. We managed to get them a leavers assembly set up for the last day of term. We managed to get them some shirt signing and things like that, so they could at least feel like they had a goodbye to the school, albeit we'll hopefully do a proper goodbye when they leave.
No, I feel the home learning pain. I've got a year 11 son who was focused on his GCSEs, and it was quite a big thing for him to deal with, really, because we noticed probably about 2 or 3 days after they knew they weren't going to sit their exams, it was just like someone had taken his batteries out because he was so charged and focused, and I felt really sorry for him. He's got over it, that he's not having to study for the pressure of the GCSEs, but for those children, it must have been particularly tough at that moment in time. Just want to go back to something you mentioned there with the schools being open. It's been a misconception in the papers and online that schools have been closed. I've got, I work with schools. I've got many of my family members are teachers, and they've been in and out. They've been rotated. How have you managed that? Firstly, from as you said, staff being with at-risk individuals, so maybe not being able to come in, and the consistency and continuity of numbers is probably unknown as well. How have you managed to do that?
Yeah, perhaps if I address the second point first, actually, about the consistency of numbers. Well, we asked our parental body how many students we were expecting in with all the categorisation that Gavin Williamson put in place. And we were expecting on the first Monday something in the region of 30 plus students in, which would have been significant enough. And you start to think of different groups, and you start to think about the social distancing that would apply, how you could use the spaces in the school differently. But the reality is that never manifested itself. So for us, we have a large university hospital on our doorstep, Queen's. None of the Queen's staff sent their children in. They took the view that they wanted to keep their children at home in lockdown, that for, if you like, the safety, not specifically around our school, but as part of society. So we immediately lost virtually all of our medical key worker professionals in that mix, which was a significant number. So we also, none of our educational healthcare plan students came in. One came in part-time initially, but then parents changed their mind. So what we actually ended up dealing with is students that largely fell into that sort of vulnerable social care category and working with social services, which means there's been an unknown number of children that are going to come in each day. We've tried to work out roughly the pattern of what it is. And that did us well for the first 3 or 4 weeks. I think slowly some other, loosely speaking, key worker students, children of key workers have come in. So, for example, postal workers. One of our parents works in the job centre, and therefore clearly inundated with business at the moment, as sadly the reality of the economy. So we've tried to then be flexible around those. Until a couple of weeks ago, we weren't going beyond 7 in a day. So therefore, the management of the staff rotas is relatively easy. We have gradually seen that number increase. We hit double figures for the first time last week. And of course, double figures starts to mean you have to go to a model of more than one classroom. Very crudely speaking, you can get about 8 to 9 students in a classroom, socially distanced. Clearly, there's some other big spaces as well. You've got an empty school with halls and sports halls and canteens. So actually, social distancing isn't a problem. Now, if that feeds into the staff answer, the staff, with the exception of those that were utterly in lockdown because of GP advice, hospital advice, they've largely been absolutely fine with rotating in. We've gone for a model of staff are rotated on for 3 days in this first 10-week period, which we did 10 weeks until the end of this week. So staff do a 3-day stint, and then that's their job done in terms of in school with those students, and they just go back to their remote learning through setting the work packs, marking, and that sort of thing. So that's gone down well. We were quite careful with how we put the teams together, so they had different skill sets, trying to make sure we had staff that would take students out and about in sessions. I think the idea that it's any Concrete learning should be dispelled pretty quickly. I think what we've done is some learning. We've guided them through work packs, but we've also done a huge amount of what I'd call childcare, really, looking after the students, reassuring them, giving people breaks, giving people like foster parents breaks during the day to recharge batteries. So I don't know, the students have necessarily benefited hugely from, if you like, work in school and being in school as a learning experience. But they've benefited from that social and emotional continuity of being in school, which for those students that are most vulnerable in society, I think matters massively.
Yeah. And staying with that point, that kind of social interaction, building of that emotional intelligence that children get every day in school. One of the things we've noticed in the Realise Me community, which is online, is quite a deep, rich community, is how many teachers, and actually, if we were to look at the demographic, because we do track lots of data, is that mainly younger teachers have reached out to peers for having a bad day, a bit of mental health support. Maybe it's just the pressure of what's in social media. Have you managed that internally and externally? Because a lot of that will fall on your shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely. We put a rota in place initially for all senior staff to call every member of staff once a fortnight to see how they were getting on. And then we risk assessed each of those staff in terms of how often they needed calls. The calls were purely about their, if you like, their social emotional needs, their mental health needs. That we didn't talk to them at all about what work we were expecting of students. We kept that separate. We kept that through a sort of a line management structure. Whereas what we were doing was ringing up staff, almost random staff. We paired them up carefully, but there was no sense it had any correlation to what we would normally see as line management in school. And then we've adjusted that accordingly so that the members of staff that are tended to have benefited most from this, they've been stressed in different ways, I'm sure, tend to be those that have got young families where they've been busy with their family and home education. And therefore, we've tried to be sympathetic to their needs, to making them work at certain times and try to avoid going down that line that I know some schools have. And therefore, we've tended to find that they're just glad to have spent a little bit of time with their kids and us giving them the flexibility to do so. Yeah, the most vulnerable staff, I think, except for those that have lost people through COVID and some of the stress around burial arrangements and cremation arrangements, which I think is very bespoke. Yeah, some of the staff that have struggled the most are those that perhaps live on their own, or perhaps their partners, they may have long distance relationships and things, which tends to be for younger staff. And therefore, they've ended up finding themselves at home on their own. And sometimes, those might be, relatively small accommodation and things. And therefore, we've made more phone calls to those staff. Those staff have maybe done a few extra shifts on the rota to try and have points of contact and come in and have human contact. But we've also had quite a good sort of network behind the scenes. So, for example, there's a staff quiz once a week, which I think brings a lot of the staff together. I don't take part, so I can let them chill out without me being there. But I don't want to embarrass them and win either. But little things like that I think have helped a lot. Quite a lot of challenges on, fun challenges on social media as well. That sort of thing. We did quite a lot of stuff around VE Day as an example, so that we're not forgetting people. I send a daily briefing to staff as if we were in school doing a stand-up briefing. So at least it feels like everyone is kind of instructed to read that between 7 and 9. And that helps set a tone remotely of reassurance. And I think that's a big part of this is giving staff reassurance that we're not going to suddenly do anything radical as a school, but also that we're all in this together and that we don't know any more than that people are hearing on the news. I think the first 4 to 5 weeks, everyone thought we were withholding information, and therefore, stress levels come that senior leadership teams know more than the staff, which just wasn't true. And therefore, periodically we've shared the DFE briefing so that people can see what the DFE are advising, periodically share different union messages so that we can see what unions are advising. And finding that balance, and it doesn't mean to say there aren't one or two individuals we're more worried about still, but there's a limit to what we can do about that ourselves. We flag up our packages in school in terms of our employer assistance packages and things that we have, and make sure they're all right. But I won't go further at risk of identifying any individuals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. It's. I know. Just even with my own group of people is tough, and just that social interaction is the main thing. Just, I suppose you mentioned earlier that, not knowing what was going on, although it's mooted that schools are phasing back in June, and some authorities aren't, and some schools are. And I think actually there's been a bit of a dividing line with some academies and schools.
Yeah.
There seems to be a real mix of information. But when they do go back, albeit maybe phased, what do you think the challenges outside of social distancing, in just terms of people integrating after being away from a structure for so long? What do you think is going to be tough there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be multiple phases, and I think each phase will bring its own challenge. So I think initially, I think to use the proper word, creating some bubbles for students to come back for some face-to-face sessions, I actually don't think will be particularly challenging for secondary schools. I think primary schools have a much bigger issue over this half term than perhaps secondary schools do. From my perspective, I think we will be able to have year 10s in at some point this term, as per what the government want. I think we'll do some face-to-face sessions. I think we'll see how much learning they've been conducting. I know some students that have been smashing out the learning and flourishing because their parents are absolutely drilling them. And I know others that have kind of ground to a halt, if I'm honest. And so I think the first phase that we will go through is a bit of a soft assessment to see where they're up to. There's no tests or anything like that, but actually sitting down with tutors and things like that and trying to work out exactly what the students need to catch them back up, and use this half term as a bit of a catch-up period. So for secondaries, or at least at Marshall's Park, I don't think we're going to be seeing year 7 to 9 in at this half term at all, and therefore I don't think the challenges are as great as come September. I think the primary sector has a much bigger challenge now about trying to manage different year groups in. That said, I think the biggest, most obvious challenge is adolescents being adolescents. If it's a child and it's their birthday, they're going to want to give birthday hugs. They're going to want to pass the balloons over. They're going to want to, all of those sorts of aspects. I think there's some real pragmatics become an issue. Toilets. We only have 2 blocks of toilets, one for girls, one for boys in the school. And as such, we're going to have to make sure there's only one person in there at a time, which, it's things like that we will have to think differently about. Clearly managing, assuming that the DfE carries on with Boris Johnson's announcement on Sunday of this week, that we'll only have a maximum of a quarter of our year 10 students in at a time. I don't think that's a challenge for us at this time over this summer term, but that in September at some point, as we reopen normally-ish, and I don't think we will reopen normally, but there will be some sense of more year groups involved. That's going to be much more difficult to manage. Managing tight corridors down around our canteen area will be a challenge at Marshall's Park, and every school will have those unique challenges. Some schools won't have that problem. Other schools will have a depth of problem. I'll give you a really small example. We wanted to try and buy some of the black and yellow tape to do some marking of 2 metres on the floor. And a small roll of that tape was retailing at over £7 a roll. Well, schools cannot afford that. And so therefore we have to think differently. We can't just sit there and say, well, we need black and yellow tape on the floor, because that's not how we're going to operate. So there's lots of logistics to think about. I think it'll be easier while the weather's good, because you've got the space to go outside. I don't think I'm anywhere scientifically able to crystal ball gaze into the future, but I think we must be prepared to accept the fact this is unlikely to be entirely resolved before weather turns in, say, late October, November. And therefore, I think the way we manage the situation on a wet, horrible, cold day when we're trying to get as many year groups in as possible in November may be very different to how we're managing it now, how we manage it in September, how we manage it by that stage. And so I think they're the sorts of issues we have. Logistically, in terms of the staff availability, will obviously change at different times. Either their own health will change, but also just their underlying health issues. A lot of my staff are still trying to get clarity from their GPs and their hospital consultants around what this terminology of extremely clinically vulnerable, or however the government phraseology worked it, and what that means. So at the moment we're working on the assumption that staff that were originally deemed vulnerable and not available aren't available, but that will fluctuate, I'm sure. And obviously there'll come a point where we might have more demand by more students being available than staff. But at the moment, the two seem fairly harmonious at the moment for secondaries. I think the primary schools in the trust have got bigger issues already in that regard, in that how do you shuffle 3 year groups into a school that's designed for 7 but keep them in their bubbles? It probably can't be done when the government is saying we shouldn't use rotas.
That's really interesting. Actually, the primaries will have this difficult task, and I suppose the children are, that much more difficult to keep orderly as well. With that, how much they do hug and interact.
I think that's an interesting point, because I think secondary schools will come back to a world where perhaps it initially appear like we're being more draconian, because we're going to have to be very strict with students about not hugging, not, keeping their social distance. And I think some students will find that really difficult and really challenging. You hope that the parents during this time period have spent the time reminding them of these rules and why it's there. And the parental responsibility is huge in that regard, because if all the students come back with a mindset of, yes, it's social distancing in schools, then the age of group I deal with, I won't have a problem. But you suspect that won't be the case, and therefore it will be a case of constantly reminding some students about the need to be socially distanced, because actually if we let a few break those kind of rules, then that's when the staff concerns will grow exponentially. It is really important. We are not just a social distance school, not just seen to be a social distance school, but that we proactively encourage that in our environment.
100%. Going to take you back to something you said you couldn't do, and that's look into the future. Just as a final kind of close to this, when it all is all said and done, and schools have had to, and we've kind of seen how fragile we are just as a society, how a disease or a bug can disrupt everything we thought was normal. Do you think within schools they will, over a period of time, just slip back into doing exactly what they did pre-COVID? Or do you think they'll now, undertake technical change rather than undergo it, look more at the distance learning and these support mechanisms? Do you think there'll be some new positives come out of this?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity for some new positives, yes. I think they're I don't know news the right word, but I think the profession has been very focused on exam results over the last few years, and has probably not spent as much time on some of the whole child development as perhaps some of the previous time periods I've worked in education. And I think there's an opportunity to resurrect some of those debates at the moment. I think there's a question at the moment about whether the government and the unions can get on a similar page around all of the ending of lockdown. If they can, and they can write a new script for the future, not necessarily hand in hand, given that the political differences between them, but at least with a view as to what an ideal education system could look like, then I think there's certainly a will from teachers and from senior leaders in schools to have a new agenda, to have a new dialogue. And my sense is that's reinforced by local authorities, that's reinforced by a number of trusts in the country as well. I suppose there are some questions. One of the biggest questions I'm left with here in kind of late May 2020 is what the exam system will look like next summer, and what the exam system will look like for the current Year 10 students going into Year 11. That's an early indicator as to whether the government is prepared to adopt a new tone, a new dialogue with schools. Because if we go back very quickly to the exam system that we've traditionally had for next summer, then I think schools will slip back into the pattern and the ethos of the last few years, and therefore I think very quickly we will look to resurrect and resume business as usual, as it has been in the last few years under a predominantly Conservative-led government since 2010. I think there is a question about Ofsted and when Ofsted inspections resurrect themselves in schools as well. Again, if the government was to announce that Ofsted wasn't coming for 18 months, for argument's sake, 6 months or so to see the end of this crisis period, and then another year for us to allow to focus on what really matters in schools, that will help. If Ofsted inspections resume on September the 1st, then again, that kind of pushes head teachers and senior leaders into a little bit of type in terms of getting ready for Ofsted. So I think there's an opportunity there. Do I think schools will think about their online platforms more as a specific part of that? Yes, I think they will. I think what's been shown is there's a difference between the schools in the most affluent areas, the schools that have got access to the most funds and things like that, and the online learning and some of the barriers. It was interesting. It was even mentioned in the SAGE report last Friday around the online learning that students could access. So I think there will be a greater awareness of that. I referenced even my own example earlier about, how many students actually have access to online learning, and I think there will be some awareness of the packages. I think because a lot of software packages have been able to be used for free of charge in this time period, I think there will be a lot of professionals out there thinking this suits our school and our circumstances. So that when they go back to being charged, one assumes they will, at some point, then people might have a different view about what packages they prefer, and perhaps some of the things that have been taken for granted over the last few years, and some of the market share positions that have been taken for granted over the last few years from the companies. Perspectives may change. But crystal ball gazing, to go back to your original question, I think it is really difficult. I can't see a position that schools will be operating with 5-year groups in or 7-year groups in normally for several months, possibly even as far away as a year from now. And therefore, I think we're adapting all the time. And as such, we'll get to a point in the next few months, perhaps over a summer period when assuming we're not all in school, we'll think about what it looks like in September. And I think if you ask the question mid-September, you'd probably get a more firm answer from a lot of senior leaders, including myself. I think at the moment we're just about coming at the end of managing the crisis phase of this, but we're not quite in the phase of the long-term building yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's takeaways from that there's a big opportunity here for change, and this, for the horrid disease it is, could actually be a catalyst for some good to come out of this and change the focus from just schools on the doors to more rounded well-being for students.
Completely agree, and I didn't mean to say in my last answer that we're not responsible. As a head teacher, I don't underestimate my ability to influence that agenda and to control that agenda and to represent my community. The community of Romford and what I think they want. So don't get me wrong, but ultimately we are public sector servants as well, and therefore our ability to control the agenda is only ever the ability to influence the politicians at the top of that agenda. So massive opportunity. Certainly my view on it has been expressed through what I would like to see. I'm beginning to express through my professional association of ASCL, but also through things like Ofqual surveys and local authority surveys, and influencing through things like Confederation of Schools Trust through SWESET. So our power of influence, there's a door open, and we're trying to exert it. And I fully understand that at the moment the government will have these things on the back burner as well. They have to get through this crisis period. But what I'd like to think is whoever's in charge of the education department a year from now can be thinking about the things that they've heard during this time period, and use them to good effect. In a way, I would like the stability of knowing it was Gavin Williamson a year from now. But I think we've seen how often the education secretaries have changed over the last 40 years of my life. So therefore, I've got no reason to expect it to be Gavin Williamson a year from now. But I think there's enough in the public domain, whether through press or social media, that says this is where people stand now, and this is what people believe in, and it does give an opportunity to rewrite things.
Yeah, no, that's just like to say thank you, Neil. That's been really insightful. I've learned a lot during this discussion, and best of luck for the school return. I don't envy the task, but I know from the sound of things you've definitely got it under control.
Thank you, Dean. Much appreciated. See you soon.
Cheers, Neil. Thank you.